Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Future Generations Navigating the West Virginia Sugar Operations Review Preparation Manual, aka the Regulatory Handbook webinar. Tonight, we're hoping to give you an overview of the manual, layout, the documents that are in it, the usage of the manual itself. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Future Generations Navigating as well as the general policies that are currently in place for maple producers in the state of West Virginia. We have the well-known and awesome Cindy Martel with us, as well as Karen Milnes. And between the three of us, we make up a few of the authors of the book. This manual was kicked off by Brittany Ferris of Family Roots Farms. And then after she kind of got the ball rolling, some folks, including Les Ober, Cindy Martel, Mike Recklin, myself, Andrew Keeney, Sean Bland, and Karen helped finish the project. So thank you so much to those who contributed. Now, where to find this manual? The manual is available at this specific link here, but there is, if that's a lot to type in, just type in future.edu/maple into your search bar, and there is a button on our page that says Regulatory Handbook. Just click that button, it'll take you to the download. This handbook was made possible through funding from actually two ACER Access grants, one from 2017 awarded to the WVDA and one in 2019 awarded to OSU. So big shout out to our funding source. Thank you. Now, if you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box, which you can locate at the bottom of your screen, or the Q&A section. We will also leave time at the end for folks to ask questions. And at the end, if you feel like you want to voice your question, just hit the raise your hand button and we can help unmute you so you can talk to any of the three of us. And always, if you have any questions that come up in nights to come or more involved questions that might require more in-depth answer, feel free to email us at syrup@future.edu. And one of us will definitely directly reach out to you with more information and any help we can provide. Disclaimer. This is a tricky document. It does not cover every and all regulations you may come up against. It was specifically designed for West Virginia sugar operations looking to be in compliance with the West Virginia Department of Ag recommendations. That said, WVDA recommendations follow many national standards, and much of this will hold true state to state. If you are in another state, reach out to your Producers Association for guidance. Below are some contacts if for specific states to reach out to if you want to talk about your state specific regulations. And also keep in mind, adherence does not guarantee or imply inspectional success. Educate before and during regulation. There are people to help you. Please feel free to reach out if anything's unclear or you just have a question, or even if you need somebody to come help look at something before inspector shows up. And then also keep abreast of local, county, and state health department mandates and regulations. These things are always changing, so just make sure you stay up to date. And we are going to try to keep this document as up to date as possible. So from then to now, we see how it used to be in these parts with horse and buggy gathering sap. And now we have, this is actually Jamie Schuler out of West Virginia University educating folks on using tubing. So there's a lot that has changed and a lot that hasn't changed about the maple industry in those years. Oh, there's animation in the slide. Why prepare? This is a roadmap for risk management. Risk management is important to any sugar operation. It is truly how you make sure you keep yourself in business and free of any liability, as well as make sure you're keeping your consumers and visitors safe. This is also a decision-making tool. This can help you decide how you want to set up your sugar shack, what modifications you want to make in the future. This can also be a buyer request. There are some buyers on the market, especially for bulk syrup, that want to see that it is made in a safe, up-to-date facility and is going to be safe for their consumers. This could also lead you to new markets and revenue streams. Once you are inspected and know you are safe, you might be able to open yourself up to bigger revenue streams in the future. Insurance requirement. Some insurance agents might want to see that you're inspected before they take on your business in their insurance. This is also for guest and visitor protection, making sure that your sugar shack is safe to visit for those who want to come and see what you're doing. This can also be proactive and reactive. So proactive means you're doing it before anything happens, and then also reactive, if something does go wrong, being able to look back and figure out why it happened and change. You also want to look at your business growth and development. As you grow in size, these regulations are going to be more and more applicable to you. So sometimes starting when you are small and making sure you are compliant will help you grow smoothly in the future. This addresses all forms of risk in agriculture production. So looking at both your risk in product making as well as your risk to visitors. It's just trying to look at like risk from every angle as much as possible. Your legal risk, your marketing risk, your personnel and management risk. So any risk you take on with employees, production risk. So the safety of your production practices, and making sure you are doing everything as safely as possible. So there's a lot of interconnection and overlap in this, as you can see from this diagram. Your operation has a little bit of all of this, and that's why it's important to make these roadmaps and look at the regulatory and look at your inspection guidelines to make sure you are covering at least most of your operation, if not all of it, risk-wise, and making sure you have a good grasp on what is going on. So an operation review requirement checklist, this is the document that is on the inspector's clipboard. So this is what they're looking at when they're in your sugar shack. And this is actually where the manual started. So looking, this started by Brittany looking at the inspection checklist and then backtracking to figure out what producers need to know to be able to accomplish everything that is asked of them on that checklist. It's transparent. It's not out to get anyone. It is meant to be able to be met fairly easily by folks as long as they're following best practices. It's not out trying to be nitpicky or like get the little guys or anything like that. The FDA's mantra is educate before and during regulation. So these operations reviews, are meant to also be a learning experience. So if you do fall into non-compliance on something, it's not the end of the world. They're going to mark that you're non-compliant and they will actually allow you time to become compliant. So it's not like cut and dry, oop, you failed. It's more, they want to make sure everybody's doing their best and they want to spread the education necessary to make sure that everybody's following best practices. Most West Virginia maple producers, as of right now, will not need an inspection or facility review. what is coming up a lot is more and more buyers are asking for inspections, which is where it might come across some of you all. It could also come across some of you all in if you're holding agritourism events. We want to make sure that people are seeing best practices operation, not non-compliant operation. For the most part, if you follow good manufacturing practices and sanitation recommendations, you will be okay. But also, if something is deemed a best practice, even if it's not on the regulation checkpoint, you should probably still be doing it just because it is best practice. And it's always good to keep on top of any new information that's coming out, because people are always doing research and figuring out new and better ways to do things. So it's a good idea to just keep yourself up to date. And there are limited control points. These are critical control points are things that you must hit. One of them is that your syrup must be at least 66 bricks. This has to do with the sugar content. And that is, for it to be legally considered maple syrup, it has to be at least 66% sugar. The other one is that you have to bottle at least 180 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is to make sure that your syrup is shelf stable in the bottle. So let's talk about manual format for a little bit. It is divided into 12 sections. There are 11 criteria and one section that is focused specifically on lead. And it's actually divided into the same 12 sections that are on the inspector's checklist. So this follows the checklist very closely, and there's actually a copy of the checklist in the first part of the manual. There's also an appendix. So for the sake of brevity of the document, it's already quite long. Some of the larger resources were broken off into an appendix, which is also downloadable from the future.edu/maple website. So if you're interested in some of the appendices, just download that document and they're all there. And the last thing I'd like to point out is, even below those 11 criteria, the handbook is divided into subpoints, and each one of those subpoints refers to a specific checkbox in the the operations inspections checklist. So for an example, down in the bottom left corner, you see section 2 buildings, and the first one is shielded lights, and there is a checkbox on the inspector's list that says, are their lights shielded? So that's kind of how this is organized in general. And moving forward, we formatted this so it could be printed double-sided on a home printer and fit into a 3-ring binder. And this is because we want this to be a living document and a customizable document. So on the right hand of your screen, there is a page that says remove this page and insert your own filter use protocol here. Use this page as a guide. So the idea is that you would sit down and look at your filters in your operation and write up your own standard operating procedure, or SOP, for your filter setup. Because everybody's operation is a little different, it's good to make one that is custom to your sugar shack. But then what you can do is, once you make that, you just print it out, pull this page out of the book, and put your SOP in the book. So it becomes your own and customized to you. And then the nice thing too is, as we go through years, if anything changes, if new regulations come out and we change our regulatory handbook, hopefully what will be able to happen is you can just print out a couple new pages and put them in for some old pages that are now out of date. So we're hoping by having it in a 3-ring binder, you all can add as much as you want to it, and it'll be easily changed throughout the years as regulations come and go and change. And then also feel free, it's good to write your own, but you don't have to start from scratch. Feel free to use any of our example documents as a basis for writing your own, but just make sure that it is accurate to your operation. So standard operating procedures, I just use that word in the SOP. And what it is it's a detailed written instruction describing logical progressive steps to achieve uniformity in the performance of a specific job or function. Basically, what you're trying to do is set out the exact steps that you follow to do something. And that is to make sure that if you do it, it happens the same way as when one of your employees does it, or when a friend does it, or when whoever does it, it always happens the same way. And this is to help provide direction to somebody new. It could be really helpful if you're bringing on a new helper. It's also a good way to improve communication. So it's an easy way to show somebody who's new to your operation, whether it's an inspector or a visitor or a new employee, how you do something. They can read your operating procedure. It can reduce training time. It can improve your consistency, so it's done right every single time. And when you're developing your SOPs, plan for the results. So have your end goal in mind, which in the previous example would be a clean filter. And then you can kind of start with that being the last point and work backwards, because sometimes that's easier to think about everything you do to get to that point once you know where you're trying to get to. And also have internal review. So if you already do have an employee or you work with a spouse in your sugar shack, have them look at it and say, yeah, that's how we do it, because they might be able to think of a step that is currently slipping your mind. Sometimes the things we do a lot and often are hard to lay out the actual steps we do. And just a quick shout out to the link at the top of the page. That is for Adcon Resources, or Adcon Food Safety. And it's a resource for small to medium farmers to prepare and understand the food safety regulations they're subject to. And they focus specifically on GAP, but they have a lot of cool worksheets and useful information as well. So a little bit more about formatting your SOPs. You do want simple steps. You want this to be easy to follow. And if you were to hand it to someone new, they'd be able to figure out what you're talking about and do it correctly. Hierarchical steps can also be helpful. This basically means that you have a larger, more broad step, and then you can even break it down into sub-steps for somebody new. And another consideration is you can make them graphic. If you want to put your SOP above where you wash your filters, so that way you don't have to go looking for it. It's just right on the wall in front of you. So you make sure you cover every step. Sometimes a nice little graphic can be helpful. And that is sort of like a flow chart down here. This is, I mean, we all know this process of collecting sap, moving it to your sugar shack and evaporating it until it's syrup. But sometimes just a little graphic can be helpful in the heat of the moment or when you are busy. And the last thing I want to talk about before handing over the floor to Cindy is customization. I want to say it again. We wrote this document with the hopes that everybody would customize it, make it your own, make it specific to your operation. It is meant to be used by you, and it will not hurt our feelings if you jot notes all over the pages and use it. That's what it's there for. And we also want, it can be customized also to add any other farm enterprises or standalone. So you can have it for just your sugar shack, but if you have other enterprises that you participate in that you kind of like want to roll this document into some of your other regulatory documents, if you have them, you can always kind of combine them or house them together so that everything for your farm is in one spot. And again, this was written for West Virginia, but it can be adapted for other states. So the document as it is for West Virginia, but just check with your local state regulations because there could be a lot of overlap and it's just a few things that are different. But if you are not in West Virginia, you do definitely want to check in with your local regulations. And from there, I would like to hand over the floor to Cindy Martel. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. It's good to talk to you. For those of you that don't know, I'm talking to you from Wyoming. We just finished a major wind event. So we've gone from about 80-mile-an-hour winds down to nothing in the last hour. So we're finally getting our bearings here. So thanks to Kate, and huge kudos. She actually took some slides that she didn't create, and I loved it. It was a great presentation to start us off with. The other thing I wanted to share with everyone is that we're very excited about this document. It's been the culmination of a lot of people's efforts. It's kind of the stutter, stop, go kind of thing. But I think that at the end, the document really meets the needs of the industry in West Virginia. For those of you that may be new and you're like, Cindy, I only tapped 200 taps. I mean, what do I need this for? What we'd like you to do is consider how this might help you grow in your operation. You know, this maple syrup enterprise is very seasonal. It's a short time frame, but it can be very impactful to your bottom line in terms of revenue and what you're doing on your farm. So again, as Kate said, it's a living document. Please feel free to use it as best as it works for you. So there's no right answer. And with that, that's kind of what we want to talk about in terms of inspection. That whole inspection word, kind of think about that. When I say the word inspection, it brings fear, and sometimes people actually get very upset about that whole idea of inspection. But if you start to consider how FDA and the inspection process at the state and local level has evolved in the last 5 to 10 years, I'm reminded of a conversation I had at a meeting with another, actually a Secretary of Agriculture from another state. And he was very instrumental in the formation of the current Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA rules, that actually kind of have a layer in what we've got presented here this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you all to use your chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen. And what you can do is click on that and you can respond. There's a down arrow that you can respond to everybody in the group, which we would love for you to do, or you can just respond to one of the moderators. But I'm going to give you this scenario and how it relates to our criteria and how the inspectional world has changed. So the criteria that I'm bringing up is one that we'll see later on, and it talks about the fact that every maple operation should have a hand washing station. And when you say that, remember that most folks that inspect maple inspect lots of other food products. So when you sit there with the DHHR head and you say, we want you to consider what you want to see in maple syrup production, and the minute you haul out an evaporator with a wood-fired fuel source, they are like, they have no idea. You know, so a lot of what we're doing is educating those folks in terms of what we do and how it would apply to current food safety rules. So this is the current food safety rule that talks about the hand wash station, and it's also a checkpoint on the West Virginia criteria list. So if I were to look at that, and the scenario I'm going to give you is that I am actually using an old milk parlor for my sugaring operations. I've taken the milk room, quote unquote, where there was refrigeration and a water source and all that before the truck came to pick it up. And I want to go ahead and make that where I evaporate and actually do my maple syrup. And my challenge is that I've met all of the other criteria. And this is the scenario that I was presented with. Met all the other criteria, washable floors, ceilings, all that good kind of thing. But I didn't have a hand wash station in my evaporator room. So I explored, what do I need to do that? Well, the scenario I was given was that it was a load-bearing wall. It was the only place that you could efficiently hook up to the plumbing, and that it was also in a stone structure in terms of foundation. So the bottom line was it was going to cost $10,000 to do the upgrades to have someone come in and actually develop that hand wash station in order for this particular operation to pass inspection. So I'm going to ask Kate to be our gatekeeper. 1 minute, go ahead and go into the Q&A section. And what would you do if that was either your sugar operation or one of your peers asked you, what am I going to do? There's no way I can afford a $10,000 renovation to fulfill this inspectional criteria. So Kate, if you'll go ahead and start the watch, and hopefully we'll have some folks that will give us some feedback. What would you do to make that criteria acceptable so that you could pass an inspection? Okay, we have one response that says, I'm retired and say, forget it. Okay, so I'll have to put another call. You're going to go ahead and try and solve this problem. Although retirement is a good thing, but I think there's some other solutions that might help. Now we're starting to get some creative folks. I'm sorry, a question?
Oh, I was just going to say, it seems like we have some creative ideas in the chat.
There we go. All right, so I have a hang a 2-liter bottle of water over a 5-gallon bucket like a camp wash station. Mike Shaw, I think you're getting closer. Anybody else have any suggestions or feedback? And Barbara, you can go ahead and give us the produce safety answer if you want. And we are excited you're here. Keith Heasley is going to go ahead and use a cooler into a bucket. Kate, are we down to 15 or so seconds?
Yep, we have about 10 seconds left on the clock.
Okay. Okay, we'll go ahead and close the chat rather, and go to the next slide. So my question is, do any of these solutions provide an approved check mark on that inspection or checklist? So we've already done the exercise. If you go to the next slide. So what I want you to think about is look at the criteria that the inspectors have and ask yourself, does that particular solution fulfill that criteria or standard? Does it work for my space, my staff, my situation? Better known as, can I afford it? Can I train my staff? Can I observe it as an inspector? And have I worked with those regulatory folks to explore this? The answer is probably going to be right, wrong, or depends. And what happened was we started in the inspectional world using depends as an answer without solutions. So we really want to encourage you. The folks that are inspecting for West Virginia have been trained by the industry in terms of this inspection. Most of the criteria has been taken directly from our counterparts in another state. They at that time had voluntary, but we are not doing things or inspecting for things that are outside of the industry norm. And then again, like I said, those inspectors are there. They're there to get educated. They've been really great about being open to learning new procedures and finding out how that kind of fits into the food safety realm and how they can make things easier for farmers. This should not be an exercise that takes you months or you have to feel like you have to hire somebody to come in and do this. This is your operation. This is what you're doing. 90% of what you're doing is correct. And so this inspectional checklist helps you to A, streamline what you're already doing, and B, go ahead and make sure that you're meeting those industry standards that provide safe food to the public. So with this, I'm going to encourage any of you, if you're at all hesitant about these criteria and whether or not you meet them, Andrew and Sean are there to help you. The staff at Future Generations is there to help you. The other best resource you all have, and this does not happen in every ag industry, is each other. You all have an incredible network of folks. Ask Keith Heasley how to solve a problem. Ask Tom Salvetti how to communicate with folks and work through to a resolution. You've got a lot of this knowledge and expertise right in within your own ranks. And I really encourage you all to continue to communicate with each other, continue to work with the association to provide the things that you all need. So that is how you address issues with these criteria. Next slide, Kate. So as Barbara said, this happened to be taken from, I think, the University of New Mexico. But once you had the criteria and you had the question and the problem, you probably did some research and you knew that these are the five components rather of an approvable hand wash station. And you also knew that you had to provide some information in terms of instructions and where do I place them and all that. Next slide. So I communicated with the Secretary of Agriculture at the time, and I would encourage you all to have this conversation with your inspector. And I talked about the portable hand wash station. And he smiled, laughed at me, and said, correct. He said, we don't want to make these rules so that folks can't obtain them. So what I would encourage you to do is think about the criteria in terms of what solutions do I have available to me within my operation versus this is the way I have to do it. Because if you look at that criteria, it doesn't tell you how to do it. But if you go to the University of Minnesota website, you will find that you can actually go ahead and build one of those for $25 or less that meet all the criteria. So that's just kind of a way to think about these criteria as opposed to, oh, they're going to be here to write me up and I haven't done something right and I want to know all the rules ahead of time. Be able to know your operation enough to be able to solve your problems in terms of what the criteria may present to you and move forward. Next slide. So with that, what we want to do is really quick. We're not here to read this to you. It's a pretty extensive document. I think that we've given you kind of our thought process in developing it and also on how you might want to use it and also how you might want to approach that whole idea of how do I make my sugar facility something that is deemed, quote, safe. Again, that conversation that you have with that inspector ahead of time is going to also help you because they're not going to be coming into your operation blind. They're going to know that you have a real handle on what you've got in terms of structure and that your emphasis on that final end product. So section 1, and this is where I'm going to invite Mike and any of the other panelists to chime in. Oh, okay. The chat line has a 10. Oh, okay. Sorry. I think that Kate's handling that for me in terms of the format. So hopefully this is being recorded, by the way, so that folks can go back. And that's why there's a lot of slides, but there's not a whole lot of detail on any of them, just so that anybody can go back and do that and also have the link references. So next slide on lead. And Mike took the lead on this one because if those of you that have been following the industry, you know that we have the opportunity to, not we have the opportunity, but we have, Mike has been following it along. And essentially the standard for lead has been decreasing. And now at this point, I believe is down to 0 or at least 0 in some states. So thinking about that in terms of your commerce, if you're going to be shipping syrup to another state, they may have a 0 threshold for lead. And so that's why this is important. And this has also been an industry concern for many years that has been addressed. So we know that the criteria that the inspectors are looking at is this. So think about, well, I don't have any lead in my operation. Where would you find lead? That's why we talked about where they are. They're going to look at those. They're going to look at those items. Are you still doing buckets? We're not saying you can't do buckets, but are they galvanized? And what about the solder? And is there a chance that there might be some lead? Same with any of your solders within the sugar house. So with that, we've gone ahead and set the criteria. If you don't have any of those key equipment pieces that may or may not contain lead, then you're okay there because they're going to actually have an observation. So remember, in an inspectional process, the inspector is looking for verification of each of those criteria. So it needs to be something that they can observe, something that you have documented or recorded, or something that you can explain, or a combination of both. So in this case, if you have got a total tubing operation, this is a real easy, they can see that that's what you're doing, or you can describe that that's how you collect sap. If you have questions, or there might be a possibility, we've actually provided a reference for you in terms of where you can get your testing done and all that good kind of thing specific to maple equipment. And that's the big thing, is to have a lab that is accredited that can test syrup equipment or food grade materials. And so they're very limited. We are exploring the possibility of trying to get one of our higher education institutions. And Russ, you're right, you're all set. There's a definite no on this criteria for you. So you're not out of you're out of retirement right now. Can't put you in retirement yet. Next slide, please. All right, so what I've done is I've gone ahead and kind of isolated the key points. You can read through it. I've also done some page references for you. I've also referenced the A and B in terms of appendix for this particular section. There you go. All those good kinds of things. So there you go. There's your key points in that particular section in terms of fulfillment. Next slide. And then I went ahead and listed all the resources that we're providing in that manual. Again, if this isn't an issue, you can skip on to section 2. Mike Recklin. All right. Mike, thank you for being here. Mike's, for those of you that can't see the chat, says that brass can leach lead when sap goes sour or acidic. We all use brass valves, but EPA regs as of last year say they need to be all replaced with stainless. Okay, and that information, Cindy, where do I find that? That's great that Mike knows that. Well, you're going to find it in the manual because it's listed in that section. So there's a lot more detail than what these slides are showing there. Keith asked the question, is it only lead in the equipment mentioned? How about brass fittings, which Mike talked about, and those kinds of things? And again, remember, what comes in contact with the syrup or the sap? That's what you want to think about. Where does it come into contact? Mike has gone ahead and said that. So that chat has the answer to that question. And thank you for it. So again, this is what that whole manual does for you in terms of this particular criteria point. Next question. Section 2 talks about buildings. And again, we're following that inspectional criteria list. Mike also says, by the way, that this holds true for galvanized as well as brass. Next slide, please. In the buildings section, you can see there's a lot more criteria here. But again, look at it. All light bulbs, that's an observation. Exhaust, can you turn on the exhaust system, or are you ventilating through the ceiling? Just basic neatness and cleanliness. Again, those are things that are easy to do, that don't cost a whole lot of money. And that's kind of what they're looking for. Are you paying attention to your physical facility in terms of how it would impact your production of maple syrup and ultimately the product that the consumer has? Next slide. So to highlight this, it talks about the infrastructure in this section. It asks you to consider some things. If you have a self-assessment or a checklist at the start of the year, Do you see evidence of rodent feces? Where, do I need to replace a screen? That good kind of thing. What areas of my building impact that final project? And I encourage you to look at it in a 360-degree view, because one of the infamous places that we have issues with is bird intrusion into our sugar houses. So, do you have screens? Do they need to be replaced? That kind of thing. So when you look at that in terms of the criteria checklist, you're essentially looking at, what am I doing to keep my sugar house up and operational? Next slide. And again, look at the tools that we're providing in the manual. Do you need to use all this? Do you need to develop a sugar house facility review log? You may already have one. Do you need to create a schedule? You may go ahead and write some notes in pen in your manual, so that when the inspector gets to that criteria, you can explain it to them. Remember, observe, document, or explain. Making notes, by the way, we replaced all the light shields before we started operation in 2021. That 360 whole, we used to call it whole farm, but in this case, we're talking about the whole sugar operation. Train staff to be able to be alert and when they bring items to your attention, and respond to them. And so appearances matter. It saves a whole lot of time if you don't have to sit as an inspector and educate folks on the value of being neat and tidy, and on the value that you might place in terms of having a productive operation. Next slide. So as you can see, we're moving along pretty quickly here. So in section 3, we're talking about the food contact materials. Next slide. There's your criteria that you have to worry about, that they're going to be checking on. One of the items says a compressor without a settling bowl. If you don't have a compressor, then that doesn't apply. Are you using non-food grade tubing or pipe for sap or syrup transfer? Again, what is going to come in contact with that ultimate food product for the consumer? So there's your criteria. It's a yes, no. And we're going to go ahead to the next slide and give you some resources in terms of the key points. How do you fulfill those key points? And mainly that boils down to a lot of labeling. One of the things that is infamous in the sugar operations, and I get it, is that you want to take that bag of dichotomous earth, which when you open, of course, it's going to start to clump and become hard. So you're going to put it in a plastic tub with a seal, correct? Cover, rather. Take that label from that dichotomous earth, go ahead and stick it to the outside of that tub so that people know what it is, and that way you've preserved your actual supply data, so that folks can see that you're using food grade materials. So again, just some ideas and hints on how you can make that criteria work for your operation. Next slide. And so we also have a template in there that's been developed so that you can go ahead and verify that you're using food grade materials. And again, like Kate said, make it your own. We talk about how you want to make sure that your SOPs reflect what you are doing, not what you would like to see that you're doing. In the food safety world, we talk about documenting when the restroom facilities were last serviced. And in an ideal world, you would love to do that every day, but what is the reality of that? So you need to go ahead and write your SOPs to the reality, which is it probably only gets done once a week. And that may or may not be true, but just say that, you're going to be held to the standard that, well, you said you were going to do it every day, and I'm looking at this and you're only doing it once a week. So if you put down on your SOPs, I'm doing this once a week, and you end up doing it every day, it's okay, because you've set your standard and you can document that you have met or exceeded your SOP standard. Next slide. Now we go on to section 4, filters, and we know that there are lots of different options for filters. So again, this is a section that's very customizable to your operation. Next slide. There's the criteria. The one thing that is, you can look at it and see right away, this is what I do. If I don't use pool filters, then it's not applicable. And that's going to be reflected in the comment. So you're going to have, you know, a different check. Your operation and what filter you use is going to reflect how the inspector looks at your operation. So again, if I'm using a filter press, then I'm going to have to look at that food grade lubricant. So I want to make sure that I have that stored away from the actual production facility with the label intact, because I'm going to need that later on down the road for some other criteria. But in this case, I'm going to be able to answer yes, and we move on in terms of the criteria. Next slide. So again, we're looking at that. I pointed out the dichotomous earth just because that is one thing we are running into on a regular basis. And you know, it's not a big deal to just tape it to the container. That way, you know what's inside. If you can put a date on there, great, that kind of thing. The food grade lubrication, make sure you have that material data sheet, and we'll talk about those in another section. If you're not using disposable one-time use only filters, you know, you're going to have an SOP for how you clean those and how you watch out for mold to make sure that you are preserving the integrity of the syrup that goes through those particular filters. Next slide. And Kate and Karen are throwing up a bunch more resources for you in the chat box. So hopefully by the end of tonight, you'll at least know where to go. And we're not advocating that you go to every place and that you cover every section in depth and detailed. Look at the areas where you think you might need some help. I think that if you go through and use that criteria, that inspection criteria checklist to do a self-assessment and find out where the areas that you need to focus on, and then hopefully you can go to the manual, and then from the manual you'll have the resources and tools that you need to solve the quote-unquote problem or areas that you're concerned about. Again, there's some resources there for the section on filters. Next section. This is about sanitation. Next slide. So this is where we talk about that hand wash station. And yes, you do need to have one at a Maple operation. We talk about toilet facilities. We also talk about signage and those kinds of things. So let's go to the highlights of this particular section. So this section, a lot of it is one of those deals where you probably are doing it, but you haven't maybe thought it all the way through. So we talked about that hand wash station and signage. I pointed to the 5 important things. A lot of times folks forget the step that you need to provide a covered garbage for those paper towels, and one-time use only paper towels is what you need. Don't be using one of those continuous fabric hand drying units. You want to go ahead and paper towel, disposable, one-time use. I love this toilet facility one, mainly because I'm going to actually point to an example in West Virginia. And it was, you know, Cindy, our sugar house is 6 miles out. We bring in our water for our water supply to do the things we need to do. And we're not sure the porta potty people would even come out to our place. Well, they came up with a solution, which was using one of the compostable RV facilities. And so to think that all the way through, then we also provided a spot on their documentation record where they showed that they had brought it to an appropriate disposal facility, or, you know, what did they do with the waste product? And once they did that, then that works. So understanding that you don't have to have access to the latest, greatest to make these criteria work for you. A hand wash sign, how do you do that? And instructions. The good news is when we get to the resource part of this section, you'll see that we've provided you with templates to all that. And, you know, Kate would love to give you all the signage that you need. So again, you know, there are resources for that. You don't have to spend $75 for a sign. Oh, Coonskin Park has a new kind of outhouse. Yes, the National Park Service has $1 million one at Kennard. We used to talk about. Keith Easley probably knows what I'm talking about. So yeah, there are options for this for your facilities. And again, it doesn't have to be the latest greatest. We all know that sometimes sugar season means that you're there for multiple days at a time and at all hours of the day and night. Pets in the sugar house. Ugh, this one's a tough one. I know that. And so we talk about, you got to leave Fido at home. You know, it's just for them to be in the sugar house, you're basically processing food or you're making food. And because of that, you can't have pets in there. And that's something that an inspector will just key on very quickly. So just don't do it. Clean water supply again. You know, you don't have to have municipal water. If you do, I would encourage you all to go down to your PSD and get a certificate so you can document that. And again, put three holes in the side and put that right inside your manual. And if not, then they recommend that you definitely go ahead and get that tested. I would encourage you to look at the link that we provide in the manual, because those are approved potable water testing as opposed to industrial water testing sites. And so there's some places to do that. I know the Department of Agriculture, out of their Moorfield office, their lab, they can do it for you. A lot of the health departments have access to the state lab. So there are ways to get that done relatively low cost, and you can document that. But you do want to have a potable water source and go through there. Appearance, clutter, that's covered in here. Then the other point in this section is talking about gray water. What are we going to do with that water from the RO or from the evaporator? And we're not talking about cleaning and disinfecting water. We're talking about the gray water, and we're talking about that process of solarization. So I would highly encourage you to think about what you're doing with that and talk to your peers and talk to the folks at Future Generations or the folks from other sources that can talk about what you need to do with that. Solarization basically is the process of discharging that water out into the soil, because we know that it's got a slight acidity, but the process of actually discharging it out into a well-drained area and having it be exposed to the sun for a significant amount of time might be an acceptable solution depending on volume and a lot of other things and applicable rules and where you're doing it. So again, explore that before the inspector gets there so that you can answer definitively what your solution to that criteria is. Next slide. Lots of opportunity for resources and those kinds of things in this section. And again, go to the manual. Next slide. Okay, product coding. This is probably the most extensive section we have in the manual. Next slide. Interestingly enough, there's only one criteria checkpoint. So with that, next slide. Here's our key points. Kate, can you give me a feedback on time available?
Oh, we're doing well on time, Cindy. Probably.
She got 10 more minutes.
Yeah,
but we
10-ish.
can go 9:30.
Yeah, 10-ish more minutes, but we can always run a little over if needed.
Okay. I want to leave lots of time for questions, because I know we're going through this pretty quickly, but I also don't want to just read slides to you. So here are the key points on product coding. The essential thing is all drums and containers must be coded. This section also explores intra versus interstate commerce. What do I mean by that? Think about where your syrup is going. Are you distributing it through a retail outlet, or are you only selling at farmers markets? The rules are going to change or be different based on where your end result is. Remember, interstate is the highest level. So therefore, if you fulfill the requirements of interstate commerce, i.e. FDA approvable or formatted label, then you're going to be able to meet the requirements intrastate. But think about that not only in your beginning and startup with the 200 taps, but where do you aspire to be? You know, graphic design and plate costs and all those good kinds of things, runs of labels that are more economical as you increase the amount. Those are all things you want to think about if your plan is to ultimately grow into the interstate. So look at that and consider that. Wow, this is the section I would say that the team spent the most time on, trying to provide people with a really good snapshot, easy to understand. So I'm going to ask you to look at pages 52 and 53, which is an adaptation, and Les Ober, I know you're on. So we went ahead and did not reinvent the wheel from Ohio. And we talked about those 4 essential elements of a food label on pages 52 and 53. It's pretty highly graphic for you, and hopefully is an attempt at a straightforward example of what that food label has to have. We're going to talk about traceability in the next slide. One of the questions that I'm going to pose to you, and we won't spend a lot of time with feedback on this, but a lot of folks do pre-printed bottles. They're going to be ordering those from a manufacturer, and they're going to be pre-printed. And we know that those pre-printed bottles have 3 of the 4 elements that are required on a food label as referenced up above. What's missing? Well, the part that's missing is you have to go ahead and you have to have ownership of the contents of that bottle. So they obviously don't say who you are, where you're from, how can we find out where this is being made, and more importantly, in my mind, how can they get a hold of you so they can reorder? Yes, reorder. So there's a marketing component in that too. So remember, if you're using your pre-printed bottles or containers, you're going to have to provide that. You can do it in the form of an address label, that kind of thing. Just making sure that you preserve those 3 elements that are already included, but there's not a problem with using pre-printed bottles. There's other types of labels out there. There's the barcode. There is, you know, some folks use QR codes for recipes and information about my sugar house and direct you right to the website and how can you come visit us and how can I order. There are some folks that are organic. And so that you can only use the organic label on your product if you adhere to the organic standards and you're certified, but you'll find those on there. Those are all product attributes. There are things that are lending to your label. So they're perfectly allowable as long as you meet the criteria to be able to use those. We also talk about the West Virginia Grown label. We provide you with a link about that. In terms of if you want to be a part of that program, they have a voluntary label review program where they can look at your label and provide a document for you that says that they've looked at it. It's got those 4 components and go from there. The only thing I will warn people about is putting attribute statements on there that are related to nutrition. So in other words, low fat, my syrup is low fat. Well, that happens to be true, but and that one, and you know, that one you can easily do. But if you say use of my product will lower your glycemic level, that's a medicinal claim, and that's one that you would have to get permission and go through some pretty rigorous testing to be able to verify. So those kinds of things are something that you want to go ahead and on a one-on-one basis, a product by product basis, go ahead and have checked out in terms of your ability to put them on there. We're also finding a lot of folks that are using descriptive words like artisanal and those kinds of things. And they're allowed as long as you follow those 4 essential elements and look at it in terms of placement and there's some printer requirements and all that. So again, the best part of this criteria is to go ahead and use those resources and don't be afraid to ask questions. We also know that labeling requires record keeping because you're going to have that coding that brings you back. We could do a whole session on coding and that kind of thing. But next slide, please. Mike Recklin and I had a conversation and he was just like, Cindy, make me understand this traceability thing and this state coding thing. here it is. It's one step forward and one step back. What I want to point out is this statement right here. And I think this is what I wasn't telling Mike that makes it all clear. As the producer of the syrup, you don't have to follow it all the way to the consumer. You are not responsible for tracking that date code all the way to the consumer unless you're doing direct sales. Okay, so if I sell my syrup to Tamarack, as an example in West Virginia, I'm going to provide a manufacturer or production code to Tamarack on my invoice. And then they're responsible for tracing it to the consumer. So when the call comes in and the consumer says, I've got a problem with this particular jar of jam, they will look at it and say, okay, the consumer is a step forward. They've got that code that was on that jam. Tamarack then would go back one step with that code to you as the producer, and that's and you can go from there. So you're going to have the record of any of your key ingredients, in other words, any defoamers or anything you use, but the consumer won't have that information, and you're not responsible for providing the consumer that information. You are only responsible for being able to trace back what product left your front step. So with that in mind, that's kind of an overview and a simplistic example of traceability, but that's why you want to have a date code or some kind of a code. Is one step forward and one step back a federal requirement? No, and Mike, let me go ahead and I'd forgotten this example. So, okay, I only have 1,000 taps and I only do 80 gallons of syrup a year. So I'm just going to code my syrup all 2021. So I have a problem. My syrup was put in a warehouse, 10 gallons of it was put in a warehouse and exposed to high temperature, and there's some mold questions at that warehouse. They're going to come back to me. So a consumer files a complaint. So the feds, the federal folks, or even the state folks are going to come back to me because my name is on that syrup, and they're going to say, okay, I have a code of 2021. I have a code of 2021. And we've got questions about it. So what are they going to pull? They're going to pull everything that's coded 2021. Whereas if I had done 2021 and I did it in 4 different boils and I coded my product that way, I can isolate it down to just those 10 gallons and the heat, and I don't have to get rid of or have come into question all 70 gallons. We're just dealing with the isolated 10. So this is a liability protection for you, so that it's not the whole crop. You're able to isolate it down in terms of internally. Now, does that mean that I can't that I have to put a batch code on there, or because I only have 100 trees and I only get 20 gallons, I don't. I put 2021 on there? You're fine, just understanding that that's what you're opening yourself up to. If there's an issue, if you can't isolate it by batch or a smaller lot, then you're looking at whatever that code references in terms of your inventory. So we would invite you. One of the things we're going to do at the end here is give you an opportunity to say, we want more information, give us more resources on XYZ topic. So we would love to go ahead and explore that and expand it and give you some more tools if folks are interested and need it. Next slide. Again, that was the example I talked about with those pre-printed bottles. The thing that's missing, you've got your weight there and all that, but you don't have who the producer is. Also, think about it in terms of branding. We talked about the West Virginia grown. Then, we also have, and Karen, I'm going to go ahead and let you field questions afterwards. We're working on developing an Appalachian maple syrup brand which will provide an opportunity for folks to do some aggregation. And we can talk about how the date coding all works into that, because that's another way that you can do some aggregation of products and syrup. Next slide. Here's an example, and this is right from the manual, and here's the page reference of how a date code was developed. This is an example. This happens to be the one that we used to use with our jam and jelly and pickle business. One of the things, though, is you have to be able to explain this to the inspector, and you may have to explain it to a buyer. So if you have it batched out or diagrammed out like this, you stick that right in your manual, and then it's there when you need it, and you can explain it from there, and there's your visual. Next slide. Lots of resources there in terms of resources to develop your label and all of those good kinds of things. I'm going to go ahead and point out a couple of things here. The label review, WVDA, and the West Virginia Grown Program are on there. I encourage you to look up Best Southern and Maggie Parsons. Those are two folks that are in that division that might be able to lend you some assistance. Next slide. So we got allergens. This is a pretty straightforward section. Yeah, there you go. Thank you, Kate. That's great for keeping on top of that. So here's the criteria. Next slide. Here are the allergen declarations. So the only thing I'm going to warn you about in this section, because most of the time this does not apply. So we know that maple in itself is not an allergen that you need to declare, but you need to look at your ingredients, the defoamers, and any of those kinds of products that may contain allergens or their derivatives of those up above. I'm going to throw one out at you that we've had come up against several times in food processing. Folks use Worcestershire sauce as an ingredient. Why would that get pulled off the shelf, which the last bullet point says that's the #1 reason for food recalls these days is unclaimed allergens? What does Worcestershire sauce have to do with allergens? It contains an extract of a shellfish. So indeed, you have to claim an allergen. So just be really careful, even though maple syrup itself doesn't appear to be an allergen generator, make sure that you're not going to have any issues inadvertently. The other thing is and this is the reusing of bottles. You got to be really careful about that. We know that we've had situations where folks have used decorative bottles or alcohol beverage bottles, that kind of thing, and put syrup in it and gone ahead and dispensed it out that way. And you cannot reuse bottles and those kinds of things. And a lot of it has to do with you have no idea what allergens may have come in contact, in addition to the fact that you can't assure the integrity of that bottle with cracks and breaks and all that good kind of thing. Next slide. Again, there's some resources for you. We also provide an SOP, so you can actually just make a statement. We've done an assessment and we don't have any allergens to declare. Slide that into your manual and you're done. Pesticides, herbicides, and petroleum products. Go ahead, next slide. This section has several criteria points. Next slide. Again, self-assessment. What do you got out there? This is the last point was I was trying to figure out how to tactfully say this. And so Mike Recklin, you can tell me. Don't let the sugar house become your garage during the off season. And it's real easy to do. It is really easy because, we know that covered space on a farm, a lot of times if you're doing other operations is really easy. So just think about that. And then, some of you may already have to follow pesticide applicator licenses and all that good kind of, yeah, the chainsaw mic with Fido have to go somewhere else. Yes. Anyway, look for that and just make sure part of the overall cleaning and that kind of thing. That you're actually taking care of those things, temperature control, keeping the labels on there is really important. Next slide, and I'm going to briefly mute because I'm going to cough. Okay, I'm back. Those are your these are your resources. You FIDO, Russ, yeah, there you go. Next slide. Containers, your containers. Next slide. There's quite a bit here. And basically, what they're looking for, it's one of the things we know is when you follow the critical control point of 180 degrees and you put that syrup into your jar, we know that the product itself is up to heat to prevent pathogens, but it doesn't prevent hot syrup from forming mold or yeast or some of those other non-lethal pathogens. But boy, it's really unsightly if you've got that mold or other ingredients on the shelves. And obviously it's not going to be sellable and those kinds of things. So this is really where you want to think about it. I go back to thinking about, in the produce world, we know that there's a lot of economies to scale for ordering 1,000 of a particular box. And how many of you, you only use 20 during the season at the farmers markets, you take the rest of them and you throw them up in the hayloft. And the birds come along, and so when it comes time for having to pack maple syrup into those boxes, if you take those first couple off the top, then why can't you use the rest of them? Well, that's what we're looking for there. We're looking for that. We're looking for those plastic pre-printed bottles that you may have thrown up in the hayloft, and they've got a layer of dust on them. Just taking care of those particular containers so you understand that this wonderful product that you have busted butt and spent lots of dollars to make doesn't go into a dirty container and therefore potentially spoil it for the future. Yeah, there you go. And Mike will tell you also for a quality control issue, it's a real problem. So next slide. Yeah, go into a clean container with that 180 degrees and just keep things free of dust. Pay attention to the storage. And the other reason why is, well, some folks will say, well, I can just take those plastic containers and I'm going to throw them in the dishwasher and then I'll fill them. And there we go. They're all clean. What have you done? And Mike Ruckland is shuddering, I think, up there, because you've got the chemical from the dishwashing material, you've got the odors, all those kinds of things, and they're going to impact your grade. So just be cognizant of all that. Next slide. Again, there's some references there. There's even a webinar for y'all. Remember, with your bulk containers, epoxy is a one-time drum use, and that's because the coating actually can come off and float around in your syrup and impact its quality. And that was something I learned preparing this manual, Mike. So there you go. Document the cleaning. If you're going to use drums and reuse them, document the cleaning of them. There's some great resources out there in terms of how you would sanitize a drum to be able to use it again. And then the last one is always food grade. We don't want to we want to use food grade materials that you're packing into, and that includes bulk containers. And that is a typo, MSDS, which is those material sheets, is what I was referring to at the bottom there. And keep the label, keep your purchasing records. Those are all great things to have for the inspector to know that you're doing, and those are things that you're going to have anyway. And yes, Barbara, I'm sorry. Some of us are so old school. MSDS sheets are now called SDS. So you're going to find that throughout the document, but that's what we're referring to, and we'll go ahead and get that updated. Next slide. Cleaning chemicals. Again, I would refer to that section on petroleum, pesticides, and herbicides. Same kind of thing. Next slide. You can see there's several kinds of things here, but this also refers a lot more to the person who is actually doing the cleaning and making sure that you're taking care of those employees. And who's the number one first employee? That would be you. So we went ahead and provided some resources to make sure that not only did you go ahead and fulfill the requirements. And as you can see, this criteria is still saying MSDS, which we need to get WVDA to change that on their inspection criteria. So right now, that's what we've got to go with. Next slide. Original labels, again, are essential. That way you can demonstrate that you are adhering to the intended use and the correct use. Kate, there's a typo on the second bullet point. If you'll make a note of that, please. Recommendations for PPE, personal protection equipment. That means if you're doing something and there's going to be an eye irritant or something, a chemical that can burn people, those kinds of things during a cleaning process, that you provide the resources for your employees to be able to deal with emergencies or first aid. Again, training is a critical part of this. So again, being able to explain things or document things are great. If you've got a first aid kit mounted on the wall, there you go. Clean wastewater is also an issue in this section that you need to be able to have those solutions. And again, solving for the criteria. Next slide, please. There's your resources. I would refer you to this Ohio State Emergency Plan template. It's done by Eric Barrett. Some of you may recognize the Barrett name. His brother is an extension agent in West Virginia, but he has developed a really great template. You just fill in the blank. What is my local fire department number? And those are some of the things that Kate and the rest of the team have provided in the manual. So that whole idea of being able to think about, where are we going to get resources if we need them, if in case of an emergency. Again, this is probably a higher level thing in terms of if you're doing a lot of visitors or if you're got a larger operation and you've got a lot of employees, but it's a resource there that you can use and think about. Next slide. All right. Registration of regulations and labeling. Next slide. This is talking about some of the FDA guidance and all that good kind of thing. The first thing I will tell you is that I don't know, Mike, am I going to be all right saying 99% of you all will not have to register for this? But what you have to be able to do is when the inspector comes is explain why you're exempt and why you aren't going to be there. So with that, I will tell you that considerable amount of angst on the part of Karen and Kate. They have developed a great flow chart or a decision tree, I guess is what we're going to call it, in the manual. So if you go ahead and go to the next slide, there's your decision tool on page 68. There is that voluntary label review process that's available to you. It helps you clarify those inter and intra-state sales. It references you to the West Virginia Department of Agriculture Farmers Market Vendor Guide. If you're only doing intra-state, you can look at those labeling guidelines there. And there's many layers to all this. You got to look at your product. Are you just doing maple syrup? Are you adding things to it like vanilla and doing an infusion? Are you doing value-added products like barbecue sauce? This is so individual and specific to what your operation is. So one of the things that we tried to do in this section was to cover the gamut and give you the resource so you can ask questions. So as you get into that, the important part is for the inspection, you can say why you don't have to register. And there's several tools out there. Some of them are computer-based, where you actually walk through the decision tree on the computer, all those kinds of things. And the folks that are on the Maple team and the folks out there that are resources, I will be happy to point you in that direction and have this not be a stress point for you, because there's a good chance you probably don't have to, and that will make life a lot easier. Next slide. Again, these are the resources. lots of things to do. If you're interested, and if you're interested in just saying, what do I need to tell the inspector? We can walk you through the simple steps to have that answer. And there's also a spot there in the manual where you can write that down so that you don't have to remember it when they show up. It's like, oh yeah, here we go. This is why. Next slide. This is the last section, and these are your critical control points. And some ways I almost think starting here is best, because if you meet these two criteria, then the rest of it should fall really well into place. And that's where you talk about your bricks and also that bottling temperature, which is so important to preserve both the product integrity and grade, as well as the legal requirement. Next slide. So those are the 2 points. Documentation is essential, and that production documentation, which we have provided a template for in, I believe, section 6, is essential, and it all ties into this. The only thing that we didn't bring up in that, and Mike, this was a point for you, is that hydrometer and the thermometers that you use have to be calibrated, and we can provide, we'll get you some resources for that so that it's not a big deal in terms of being able to do that and also document it. Next slide. There you go. There's your resources, lots of them. One of the things that for documentation, just a quick comment about that, making sure that your records are reviewed regularly. Are there any blanks that aren't filled in? Make sure that you can keep records, especially about those 2 critical control points, at the point of your operation. If you're going to do it through snapping a picture on the cell phone, that's great, but you have to be able to back it up, and you also need to have a way of documenting it so that it's accessible. And then look at your environment. Pen and paper probably is difficult if you've got high humidity. Dry erase boards are great until they run. Just give yourself a quick thought about that. How can I do it in the heat of the moment when that pan is coming off and it's all hands on deck? Who's going to have time, and where can I accurately record those readings that are so critical to basically the foundation of my food safety plan? Next slide. All right, I think this is the end, and where Kate takes back over and facilitates some Q&A. And I think there's been a lot of it already.
Sorry, we did a little computer swap there. This is Karen, actually. I just wanted to show, this next slide shows some of the other resources from other states that are out there. And I think that Kate actually put those in the chat earlier. So if you are in a different state, you can look at those other resources.
And a lot of those contacts are on with us, like Les and Tom. Tom is actually where this Virginia one came from. So,
yeah. So next slide. And
so in the meantime, go ahead and as you're looking through those resources, yeah, Karen, I'll let you go.
Oh, I just wanted to, we'll answer some questions, but before we get into question time, I just wanted to put a plug out for our next webinar, which actually falls next week on Thursday. We're going to have Fred Ahrens on talking about record keeping in your sugar bush and your operation. And then Cindy will do some talking about importance of certain financial record keeping to ensure that your business is being successful. So here's go to future.edu/maple to register for that if you aren't already. Many of you already are. I recognize the names. But if anybody has any more questions, we can continue to chat them in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand. And
so Russ, you said, oh yeah, Joy, paperwork. Part of it is we're going to talk about it from a producer's perspective in terms of what they do and why. And also, do you really need to keep records on every little thing? Is keeping record of what the temperature was on XYZ date as important as what was the sap flow. And the answer to that is it depends on your operation. If you're the 200-year-old farm that Mike knows about, or maybe it's Kate or Sarah, that has kept records for that many years, then maybe, yes, that is important, but it might not even be important for you. So just making sure that, you know, you can get as detailed as you want, but what information do you need to make good decisions? That's kind of the way we're trying to frame that.
All right, folks, just a reminder too, if you want to ask a question out loud or chat with Cindy, feel free to raise your hand and we can give you the ability to unmute as well.
So how do I raise my hand on this thing?
There should be a little bottom in your control bar, a button in the bottom of your screen in the control bar that says raise hand.
Cindy can't do it.
I don't know if you can do it, Cindy, because you're
No, I can't. I was just, that was a point of reference.
Yeah. And
this, you know, this is a lot of dense material. So please do reach out to us at syrup@future.edu if you have more specific questions that we can help out with.
Or if questions come up later, please feel free to reach out. We're here to help.
Another thing I wanted to mention is that the document was designed to be able to be printed, like Kate said, on front and back, and go nicely into a binder with the particular pages being able to be taken out without removing other material. But the online version is also really good because there were so many links that we had to include in there that when you have it printed out on a piece of paper, it's not that useful. So look through it online as well, so you can get some of those other resources and just click the links.
Mike, you should have the ability to unmute yourself.
All right. I would just like to say that probably the most asked question that I get is, what do I have to do to sell maple syrup, to be legal to sell it? And the decision tree, regulatory decision tree in the manual, Kate, that you and Karen put together, is an excellent resource to work your way through and to know that you're right on legal with what you're doing.
And that brings up a good point, Mike. This handbook was written to cover all regulations, but there are, depending on how you run your operation, as Cindy was saying, there are going to be checkpoints that you just skip over because it's not applicable to you. So this is also just a good document to work through, even if you're really small, just to make sure that you are in compliance with everything you do need to be in compliance with, but it might be a lot less rigorous for you than someone with, say, a much larger operation.
Another point I'd like to bring to the table is, all right, we all want to produce a good quality food product. And whether you're due for an inspection or you never have an inspection, going through, reading through this, maybe you're not going to do it all, but it'll help make you aware of things that will make your product look and feel better to consumers, and make you know that you're doing the best job you can to put out the best maple product into the market that you can.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to launch a quick poll here. We're looking at the cover slide for our next webinar, which is going to be record keeping for production and business on January 21st, 7 through to 8:30. As Karen was saying, this is part of our ongoing webinar series. And this poll just gives you a chance to say, yes, I would like to be registered for that webinar series. No, I would not like to be registered. And I am already registered. So if you go ahead and click yes, we'll get you into the system, and you'll just get a link saying you're registered. And from there, you'll get some reminder emails saying the webinar is coming up.
The other thing, and I don't know, Karen, you were going to do this or not, but we would invite some feedback. I mean, is there something, do we need to do a separate labeling webinar? Understanding that it's a pretty deep topic. Do we need to do that? Are there specific things there that you don't feel like are covered that you would like to know more about? So feedback to Karen or Mike or any of those folks, or Kate, would be great.
And feel free to send those in the chat or over email, or I know some of you know us not just over Zoom, so also feel free to reach out in any way you know how to get a hold of us. Let us know.
Thanks, folks. Nice job.
Yep.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Please feel free to keep asking questions if you have them, but otherwise, thank you so much for joining this webinar, and we hope to see you at some future webinars. Thank you, Cindy. Have a good night.
You guys okay?
Yep, we're good.
You're good? Okay, thanks.
Bye. Talk to you later.